All right, we're here. Get ready to rumba. Let's do it. Okay, we left off at virulence, basic measures of pathogenicity. So a lot of these, you're such a trouble. Not you, Grace. Rarely. Kayla, she's just talking to her. Goodbye. Shut up. Nobody cares. All right, here we go. Virulence factors. These are all of the things we're going to be talking about. To me, measures of nastiness, whatever way it works for you to memorize these, do this. So we're going to look at those down the road. Interesting, you remember, and we'll revisit it again in these chapters early on about Koch, and he had these postulates where, it's basically like a chain of evidence, how he discovered really about anthrax and how it caused the disease. It was like a single organism caused a specific disease. Understand that there's a lot of differences now. That's why we don't use those so much. There are things that are what we call polymicrobial. So if you want to think about people with, somebody with periodontal disease, polymicrobial. I saw a lot of infections in diabetics that were mixed infections. They had multiple sources of infection. Okay. So there's a lot of difference in there. So a lot of infections have multiple parts. For instance, if we see someone, the big complication of the flu and one of the big complications when COVID was so rampant was bacterial pneumonia. So you had what were called primary and secondary infections. COVID or the flu were the primary infections. They were viral. They weakened the immune system. They weakened the lungs and predisposed them to bacterial infections. And that became the secondary infection. So it's an important distinction. So we have lots of different things, okay? So you can see several types of skin infections are caused by either staph or strep. But when we put the two of them together with something called Moraxella, which is a normal flora, in other words, normally on you, it's a tiny gram negative cocci, they lead to different problems associated. So as we begin to understand, and there's a lot of nuances as you'll learn in treating them, which culprit do you treat, and how do you go about it? So interesting things. We start with what's called portal of entry. How it gets in to hurt you, okay? The route that the microbe takes to enter the tissue. So you remember, when we looked at viruses, fecal to oral, respiratory, zoonotic, blood or body fluids. So portal of entry is similar to that, how it gets to you. So is it from the outside or is it somewhere inside? So understand we have a fair amount of things. When you think about somebody with C. diff, that is an endogenous. Typically, they're in the host. Something has weakened the ability for other factors to keep it in check. And all of a sudden, it grows. Typically, broad-spectrum antibiotics clobber the rest of the bacteria. The C. diff can then flourish. It's the type that produces a toxin. Next thing you know, you have somebody with C. diff. And if you're in healthcare, C. diff, you'll know it right away. Versus exogenous sources outside the body, something you inhale, something comes in contact with your skin. So most of them have adapted in such a way that it's really the part that allows them to grow and spread, okay? And indeed, a lot of things, if they're coming in the wrong way, it's not a particular problem. So, I mean, if it's a sexually transmitted disease, okay, with blood or body fluids, it's unlikely that anything respiratory or ingesting is going to cause a particular problem. It's going in the wrong way, okay? So this is another example of that. Typically, the way respiratorily is the way we get the flu or a common cold. But if it's on your skin, theoretically, no infection occurs. Again, the caveat to all of that is if it's on your skin and on your hands, like you don't know who was in this room before you, and if they have a rampant cold and were sneezing and coughing, hopefully not, and it's still on the surface, and it could be, and you put your hand on it. This is sort of what the theory was why we had such all the spacing and things like that vis-a-vis COVID. When, and maybe you had that when you were in school, wherever you were in school, back 4 years ago. What what effectively happened was, remember, you had 5 to 8,000 times a day you touch your face. Get on your hands, touch your face, not too hard to inhale. So that's the old hand care, hand washing, hand care. And I don't see a lot of you doing it. But I would have people coming in here every time they saw a hand sanitizer, they grabbed it. Crazy. Sorry. It's okay. Nobody's judging you. But it's okay. You're bowling, for goodness sake. What could be? How do you pick up the ball when it comes out of the return? Oh my God.
Spring break is next week. I don't want to get sick.
I understand that.
Sick.
It's all right. I can. Moving on. So, an infectious agent can go different ways. So, tuberculosis, it's usually respiratory. Yes, it could happen GI wise. It's comparatively uncommon. But staph and strep, okay, Staphylococcus and Streptococcus. To me, Staphylococcus is still public enemy number one. That's the most common source of infections that we get in the bacterial family, and Streptococcus might be running a close second. Okay, skin, urogenitally, respiratorily. So understand that depending on the strain, depending on a mutation, depending on an irregularity, anything could happen conceivably. So take a look. The most common ones that we see that come through the skin, Staph aureus, Strep pyogenes, those are the most common skin infections by far. Tetanus, because the endospores are typically on your skin or on something that your skin will come in contact with. And you can see the usual things that are there. And I just said this to my MCAT class, when you get to the immunology part of the program, your skin is the most significant barrier to disease. We'll probably cover it in this chapter. It's the strongest thing that you have. So you'll learn, for many of you going into healthcare, one, you've got to be very careful with your skin, protect it at all times. Very, very careful. So, again, cold sores, mucous membranes. Worms do burrow through the skin. I mean, herpes simplex is not really skin, it's mucous membranes. I don't know why they put it there. Insect bites, typically of the skin. So, these are not unusual. Malaria and West Nile are big players. Thankfully, we don't typically have a big mosquito problem around here. I'll say it again for the umpteenth time, that you have to watch out for standing water. And particularly as we start to get into the season and it starts to warm up, somebody with a pool that hasn't been serviced and it's damp and yucky, you see a bunch of things busting around there. Don't want to go close to that. Don't go walking somewhere in the woods where it's very, very swampy if you can avoid it. And so here, conjunctivitis, I mean, this is common. GI, these are the big GI players. We'll review them again, eating and drinking. And now you're seeing an interesting word, fomite. A fomite is any inanimate object. Your phone is a fomite. Your keys are a fomite. That bowling ball aforementioned is a fomite. Okay, that's how it contacts. So again, using that thing, somebody was in here, shouldn't have come into class that day, coughing and sneezing, it's here. You got it from a tabletop, that's a fomite. An inanimate object that's somewhere assisting the process of getting it to you. So we really concern about that in food service industry, because potentially that's why if you go to a place, you want to be comfortable that all that, and that's why the sanitary department and all those things. I mean, it's any restaurant facility that gets one of those warnings that they have to either close it down, or you look on the window where it doesn't say A and there's something else. People are not going to go there. It doesn't take long. So the food itself, I'm talking about plates, utensils, glasses, and things like that. We go in there expecting everything to be fine, but we don't know. I mean, the best anecdote about that, and Chipotle lost, I can't even tell you how many millions of dollars. They had norovirus, they had bacterial infections. We were in the one up in Cranberry. If you know where that is, on 19, it was the first one that opened up there. There's a second one. And my wife and I would go in there all the time. Okay. And she went to the bathroom, and she went up to the person at the register and said, "Look, there's a problem with the ladies' bathroom." Oh, okay. Well, we knew about that. Nobody did anything about it. No sign, no nothing. I mean, I can't tell you the last time we've been in there since then. And then right after that, all this stuff came out. Their stock, they were the number one, whatever you want to call it, Mexican American Tex-Mex type place. All of a sudden, they went to number 5. They were open up like that. You can't play fast and loose with it. That's an absolutely true story. You can read about it anywhere. So all of these things, hopefully, you'll never get them. Respiratory, a whole bunch, typically inhaling. Urogenital, hopefully, you'll never get them, but they're there. And it may enter through an unbroken surface or through a cut or an abrasion. So it doesn't have to necessarily be damaged just because it can colonize the lining. Once it grows on the lining, then it can start to do damage. So all those things. These are, and so those are just examples of how they spread. These, it's a very important number. It's called ID, or infecting dose. This is one of those virulent factors. So if you have a very low infecting dose, and that's something that's highly virulent. The less it takes you to make this sick, the worse, the more we worry about that. Minimum numbers to cause an infection. Smaller the dose, greater the virulence. Something called Q fever. I don't ever recall hearing of a case in this country. I think this is something that's in different areas. I don't know enough about it. But here's interesting, and this is why you're so worried about TB. Because TB, it doesn't take, a lot of people have been exposed to that. You're going to see a lot of precautions in the hospital. Again, you might remember me telling you this, and I'll say it again. It's what's called airborne. Somebody in a room coughing with TB, those particles stay suspended. That's when we know about in the hospital. They're put in what's called reverse isolation. You have one of those exhaust fans pulling the stuff out. You're supposed to enter that with specific protection. Probably those like 95 masks that were so common during COVID, those thicker ones. They used to measure you for that. The nursing people, if you're going into that, are going to learn a whole lot about that are there. Giardiasis is from contaminated water. All 3 of my kids got that from a bad well water where they were staying with my office manager, Lola, back in 1986. It was awful. Thankfully, they were young and healthy, and it was just a lot of diarrhea to deal with. But they got better. And coccidio, I mentioned to you in passing. I didn't call it coccidiomycosis. That's known as valley fever or San Joaquin Valley fever. That's everywhere in the desert Southwest. And at times it's worse than others. If you end up moving to Arizona, the lower areas, Nevada, New Mexico, those desert areas, stays airborne in the dust. Pets can get it. You can get it. It's not unusual to get it. It needs to be treated appropriately. That's not that. Gonorrhea is a very easy disease to get. Gonorrhea, when we get to urinary tract infections, was rampant. No other way to describe it. Absolutely rampant. We saw, I can't even tell you, every day in the emergency room in the late 70s, 20 cases a day that people would have that. We were giving them, there was treatment, and they would get themselves fixed up with a shot of antibiotics, and then we'd see the same person back 2 months later with the same thing. Because it was eminently treatable, but that didn't stop people. Understand, people, there was almost no usage of condoms. People were it was a different age then. Typhoid was the very famous typhoid Mary. That's a salmonella infection. And look, that's only 10,000 cells. But when you talk about cholera, 1 million cells. And cholera It's something we see in war-torn areas or after natural disasters. It doesn't take a lot. And this may look like a lot of cells when you're looking at 1 billion cells. But I mean, a dot on a culture plate is at least 1 million. You get one of those culture plates that you've cultivated in the lab that's filled, you got 1 billion cells easy. So contaminated water will do that real quick. So it's hard to spread, but it's not hard to grow those cells if the water's spread. How they adhere, okay? So how well they bind. So again, typically it's maybe just a specific set of cells like respiratory or urinary tract. It's almost always a prerequisite, okay? Because we have a lot of ways to get rid of it. We cough, we sneeze, we urinate, we defecate. All of those types of things are ways of passing this out before it gets a quote unquote foothold. Once it gets a hold, they colonize fairly easily. Some of the things we looked at the different anatomy of these organisms. I showed you that slide. Maybe they'll show it again here. E. coli have those tiny little bristles, extraordinarily small. You can't see them under the microscope. It's an electron microscope, but under the microscope, you're looking at E. coli in the lab. Can't see them. They're there. Those are called fimbriae. Pili could also be in that. I mean, the terms shouldn't, but often are used interchangeably. They adhere to your gut cells with those. They attach onto receptors, along with other surface proteins. And we talked about capsules or slime layers. A lot of times that's how structures adhere. Slime layers are inherently sticky. It's easy for things to attach to them. Viruses have to be specific receptors. And again, we don't do worms. And boy, seeing this, I'm glad we don't do worms. Again, we have the luxury of a relatively pristine water supply, both in this area and in this country. That's what we worry about. So, depending on where you are or where you go, when you travel, and then you have to be a little bit more concerned about that. There's a lot of that don't drink the water stuff going on. So, another one. When and again, refresh my memory, you have not done the immune system yet. So you're going to do that after break. You're going to learn about a lot of this stuff. So this is a good little advance to you. You have a ton of mechanisms. If you only get a few organisms with and something which has a relatively high, as most of them do, infecting dose, you can cope with it. Okay, if you're relatively healthy, you can cope with it. That's because our immune system is designed to deal with these things. And the single most important thing you have helping you with rare exceptions is your immune system. So we have constantly on sentry duty white blood cells that gobble up invaders if they manage to get through, if they get in your mouth, if they penetrate your skin because you have a little nick or a cut you don't even know about. They grab it, okay? Useful. So cells that engulf and destroy, you're going to look at those. You did the blood unit, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All those white blood cells, with the exception of the lymphocyte, neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, macrophages are all by definition phagocytic. It's my favorite thing about your immune system. We eat. That's what they do. I want to be reincarnated as a macrophage. Means big eater. And that's your job. Go out and eat anything that could hurt us. Okay, I got you covered. Lifespan's a little short, but what are you going to do? I don't believe in reincarnation. One day. Anti-phagocytic factors. So a lot of these bad guys that makes them more virulent is they secrete or give off things that kill white blood cells. They have a big capsule or a big slime layer. So they're hard to swallow. The only way phagocytosis works is if you can swallow it. Okay. When you get to the immune system, you'll learn about things called opsonins. Okay, opsonin is a chemical that our body produces when there's been potential of an infection or invasion. And it coats, I love doing this, my favorite. I did this earlier, I was doing the immune system today, earlier. And they coat the bad guy, the bacteria, the virus, and it allows the white blood cell to gobble it up. Okay, opsonization, OPSONINZATIONS, I believe it's spelled, is literally means to make tasty. Okay, so it's like, it's like when like when you didn't want to take your pills, and your mom put it in chocolate pudding or in applesauce, that type of thing, right?
Yes.
Thank God. All I can think of every time I talk about opsonization is a wonderful movie from 60 years ago that I'll bet you've seen, Mary Poppins, the original.
Yeah.
Spoonful of sugar. You all should be resonating with that. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chimney. What a great movie. Oh, that book came out in the late 50s. There's a very interesting movie about that. That's not a great movie, but a fun movie about how the Disney people got them to do the movie. And when it came out, my sister read that to me in the 50s because she's older, 5 years, 7 months, 1 day, and 1 hour older than her. And get this, tuberculosis, who cares if it's phagocytized? It lives inside there. That's the great thing about tuberculosis. It hides in plain sight. It grows inside one of your white blood cells, flourishes, makes tons of little tubercular bacteria, and finally bursts and goes everywhere else in your body. It's like a bacterial infection that acts like cancer. Okay, moving on. So these are different ways that they establish themselves. So how do they damage their host? Bacteria, we talked about this, mostly toxins, either gram-negative endotoxin or all of them make exotoxins. They can indirectly cause your immune system to go crazy. When we get to streptococcal infections, whether it's strep throat or scarlet fever or necrotizing fasciitis, that's basically chemicals that are released by Streptococcus pyogenes. It's common of the streptococcal infections. And it causes your immune system to go off the wall crazy. Okay, epigenic changes made by host cells by microbes. It basically alters your own cells in such a way to make them resistant to your immune system. And we'll get into these in some detail. So whether it's how they attach, whether it's toxins, whether it's living inside in your lung, etc., etc. Okay, here you can see it living inside there. Different things. A lot of bacteria make enzymes that are real problems. These are, again, virulence factors secreted by microbes that inflict damage, break down barriers to promote spread. So mucus is a big guy. Some of them make a mucinase. Remember, ASE on anything. Lactose, lactase, sucrose, sucrase means an enzyme that typically breaks it down. So this is something where it breaks it down. We have a medicine we call Mucinex, okay, which used to be called Robitussin. And what it does is it's a mucolytic agent, basically. It breaks down the mucus so you can expel it. Why it was so valuable, again, during COVID or influenza. Hyaluronidase. Maybe you remember back a little bit when you did connective tissues. That's an AP1. That's what holds our cells together, hyaluronic acid. Okay, that's one of the things that's sort of the anchoring compounds in your connective tissues. Okay, and if you break that apart, things can spread. When you may do this test in the lab, you may not. It's called the coagulase test. That's the single most important enzyme that's made by Staph aureus. Staphylococcus aureus, the way we used to distinguish it between all other kinds of Staphylococcus was called coagulase test. When I was in practice, we got a report back of when we did a culture. It would say coag positive or coag negative Staphylococcus. Didn't say aureus or epidermidis or albicans. Coag positive, coag negative. What it does is coagulates all of the blood so that the white blood cells can't get to the party. And that lets staph run wild in the area. Kinases. Streptococcus makes something called streptokinase. It busts clots. It is a spreading factor. Years ago, you did the blood unit. Did you talk about TPA? Tissue plasminogen activating factor? Okay. This is on the Learn Something New Every Day School of Science. I'm so ready to be on board.
Same here.
Ready to go. Okay. About 2 days after you brought blood, if you didn't have a clot buster that you made, every time your blood clots, which is constant, okay, fixing little rut holes in the road inside your body, you will be filled with clots. We're not. That's because we have this. We have a chemical that is released about 48 hours after a clot forms called plasminogen. OJ means precursor. When it becomes plasmin, when it's activated by an enzyme called tissue plasminogen activated. It's easy to remember, TPA. You all know what TP is. So, hey, squeeze the charm. Okay. So, tissue plasminogen activator is something our body makes about 48 hours after you get an infection. You get a clot forms. And it takes plasminogen, which is already in your bloodstream, and makes it plasmin. And plasmin is a clot buster that causes fibrinolysis. You need to combust the clots. Okay, so after a clot forms, which they do, again, they do constantly, your blood vessels heal where the little ruts are, the clot goes away, and now it's as good as new blood vessel, unlike potholes in Pennsylvania. They don't just keep recurring. And I use the pothole analogy when I teach that. So, years ago, we used to inject streptokinase into right after somebody has suffered a heart attack or a stroke, if we got them within a couple of hours by catheter to bust a clot. Now, genetically, we make that, TPA. And if you're in an area where you have a lot of people, and any major hospital here would have that, if they have someone who just had a heart attack, if they can find it real quick, and they have the capacity to do it, they will use that TPA to bust the clot. My aunt, now deceased, had it done maybe within the last 15 years in Florida, where they have a lot of retirees. So they have a lot of people. She had a stroke, and it kept her alive for quite a bit. So that's what I mean, enzymes. So a lot of these bacteria, they're incompatible with us. You saw that. They're a different kind of a cell. To some extent, they thrive on our cells. So they have mechanisms to facilitate their thriving on our cells. You know, like you're going to get sick and tired about Pseudomonas aeruginosa. But have you used that in the lab yet? Pseudomonas? Yes? No? Maybe so. Okay. Pseudomonas is in soil everywhere. Burned tissue is comfort food for Pseudomonas. If you get a burn and it gets infected, likely it's a Pseudomonas infection. It's nearly impossible to treat. There's a limited antibiotics. We're going to cover that type of stuff. I mean, it's like open-faced turkey sandwiches after Thanksgiving, mashed potatoes and gravy, meatloaf, comfort food, mac and cheese 101. I like it with a little Cholula on it. Cholula, hot sauce.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a great chart about what's the most popular hot sauce. Like we're Frank's, and there's Texas Pete, and there's, Tabasco. Texas, Southwest, ketchup, mustard, Cholula. Well, we don't leave home without it.
Really? You have a
On the
little
plane,
bottle?
we're taking a little bottle of Cholula.
Do you have some on you right now?
No, I'm sorry. I should. Forgive me. So toxins, chemicals. And so this is interesting. Neurotoxins, enterotoxins, hemotoxins, nephrotoxins. It tells you what it damages. Nerves, entero, like the enteric tract or gastroenteritis. Okay, that means intestinal tissue, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, related structures. Red blood cells, hemotoxins, kidney, nephrotoxins. So there is a substantial difference. Neurotoxins are the worst because they travel the fastest. Tetanus and botulism are neurotoxins. So remember in nerves, remember your nervous anatomy? The nerves have these neurofibrils that secrete that their neurotransmitters go this way, but when they recycle them, they go back toward the cell body, the nucleus of a nerve cell, and reform them. Okay? That passageway, normally nerves signal in only one direction, but they move stuff back and forth. Botulism and tetanus hijack that mechanism, and that's how they damage our cells. And it's very, very fast. You don't have a lot of time. Okay, that's why when we talk about this, we talk about tetanus. Talk about tetanus prophylaxis. If somebody isn't giving them a tetanus shot is not enough. You have to give them the antitoxin. If we think somebody has botulism, we have a couple of hours to give them the antitoxin. If we don't, they're going to die. Very simple. It's easy. Snake bites. Snakes are either neurotoxins or hemotoxins. They're not all the same. There are 4 venomous snakes indigenous to the United States. Okay. We don't see a lot here. In Pennsylvania, we have 2. Rattlesnakes and copperheads. Copperheads are neurotoxins. It's a bite that has to be treated as rapidly as possible. Rattlesnakes, you have a little time to work with. In other areas of the country, water moccasins, known as cottonmouth water moccasins, that they're nasty. They're a very unpleasant snake. They are a snake with a bad attitude. Okay? They're a hemotoxin. At least you have a little time, but usually you're out your fish here in a swamp. Desert Southwest, there's a fascinating snake that looks like a beautiful bracelet, very tiny. A coral snake. It's a neurotoxin. There's a great old movie about that. 1955 called We're No Angels. So if you ever have nothing to do on a night, you'd love it. It's about 3 escaped prisoners from Devil's Island who are like Christmas angels to a family that's being oppressed by their employer. Just saying.
What is that called?
We're No Angels. It's been remade a couple of times. Humphrey Bogart, Leo G. Carroll, Peter Ustinov, Basil Rathbone, just to name a few. Love it. You know me. Okay, so that's the difference. So you have to be aware of these things, and that's part of the process. So red blood cells to burst, not a good thing, because all those red blood cells, the heme and the pigments, they can damage your kidney. The LPS layer, you're all very familiar with. Outer membrane and gram-negative cells. And in general, the big problem with this is your immune system. Okay? The effects, gram-negative sepsis, that lipid A, causes your immune system to widely dilate blood vessels. That gives you fever, widespread inflammation, bleeding, diarrhea, shock. So we call it gram-negative sepsis or gram-negative shock. So when Salmonella, Shigella, and I see ones will go over, E. coli, I mean, typically what happens in shock, your kidneys shut down and you can die. It's not easy. You're looking at somebody who's close. Salmonella. back in 2006. So 18 years ago, I spent 3 unpleasant nights in ICU from salmonella. More on that down the road. So just to get, and you can just look at all those and blah, 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 blah. Will the disease rolls and blah, 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 blah. So that's important too. So there's a lot of this is definitional. And that's the reason I'm trying to give you a lot of these, what I hope are somewhat clever stories or anecdotes to help you remember. And that's kind of the way I do this. If I'm jumping around up there telling you about snakes and things like that, or spoonful of sugar, it's so. Remember when he was crazily talking about spoonful of sugar? Surprised he didn't get up there and singing. You could do Sound of Music.
No.
Do, do.
No.
That's why I'm amazed the Nazis couldn't find those kids. They're always singing. Just listen, they're singing. Just saying. Okay. So you can have an infection that doesn't go anywhere. So every time you get a tiny pustule, okay, it doesn't necessarily spread. Athlete's foot generally just stays on your foot. Okay, all those a wart typically doesn't spread, or if anything, it's just localized. That's a local. It's confined to an area. Okay, systemic, typically either the bloodstream or the lymph, which you will get to. Okay, and nerves, rabies, another one I forgot to mention, cerebrospinal fluid for meningitis. So these are things that go all over. So German measles would be like that. With some of the ones, and we'll look at each of these. Focal, okay, and then it starts one place and then can go elsewhere. That's an oddball to a certain extent. So when you hear about people with periodontal disease, your mouth is just filled with that. That's why we give medicine sublingual. That's why a lot of times if a diabetic will get, they'll have something they can put under their tongue quickly and get sugar in their system. It goes in right away. Every time you brush your teeth, every time you have your teeth cleaned and scaled, you get what we call a transient bacteremia. It gets in your bloodstream very quickly. That's the trouble with these polymicrobial infections. And that's why a lot of people have to get periodontal disease, a big problem. My mom had, I'm going to tell you, 3 different surgeries, and she was somewhat older when she had this done because she really had and she was scrupulous with her teeth care. Her whole idea in life that she wanted to be buried with all of her teeth and all of her hair. She succeeded in that. 93, mind you. So my mom, I mean, she got periodontal disease, and every time we went out to dinner, as soon as we ate, right to the ladies' room, she's flossing. One of those. So, and these we'll get to when we start talking about bite wounds and gas gangrene. We have a whole unit on wound infections. Nothing, dog and cat bites are innocent compared to human bites. Okay, they are the worst. We have, even though we have similar bacteria, it's not the same. So, I mean, it's really that, and we'll talk about that. And then this is what I talked about. Primary where it started. Secondary, influenza complicated by pneumonia. A cold, bacterial ear infection. And something that, again, we talked about acute versus long-term and chronic. May make this the last part. We're all getting tired of listening to me particularly. Okay, the difference between a sign and a symptom. Okay, syndrome we can make easy. AIDS is a syndrome. It's its name, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It's a compilation of signs and symptoms. Okay, diabetes is a syndrome. It doesn't present the same in everybody. Yeah, they all have high blood sugar, but some of them have infections, some of them live a long time, some are old, some are young. There's a whole lot of differences. What's the difference between a sign and a symptom? And don't get this confused, and a lot of people do. A sign is something that is observable or measurable. Okay. You take somebody's temperature, that's a sign. Okay. Someone tells you, I have a fever, I feel warm. That's not a sign, that's a symptom. If you take their temperature now, it's a sign. If somebody says, I'm hurting all over, it's a symptom. If you all of a sudden exam, what happened? I fell on my elbow, and you push their elbow, oh, like that. Point tenderness, that's a sign. I feel nauseous, that's a symptom. You walk by a patient and you see they're vomiting, that's a sign. Observable or measurable, blood pressure, temperature, bleeding, an observable rash, any of those things. You can do that. I mean, I don't know if they do it today in the hospital or not, because we have cell phones. Maybe it's easy to, maybe you can snap pictures and put them in the chart, unless there's a HIPAA violation that I'm unaware of. I mean, again, how you're using these things today and the law, again, I haven't treated a patient in over 20 years. So I'm not here to explain that to you. You have other instructors whose job that is. You know, we did that pretty routinely. When someone would come in with a wound, we take a picture. And we had like a Polaroid, so you got an instant picture and you fixed it and put it in their chart. We didn't have cell phones, obviously. So, and you show healing. And anytime in medicine, if you take a picture, you have to have something for context. So whether you'd have a tiny ruler with you or a pencil, something that somebody can say, oh, I compare this to that. See how this big compared to the pencil or the eraser or whatever. So again, that's how you do a chart. We used to. I don't know how you chart today. Subjective, person's complaints. Objective, what you can determine from your examination. Assessment, what did it mean to you? Plan, what are you going to do about it? Call it SOAP notes. I don't know if you still use them or not. That was the way we used to do that. Subjective, objective, assessment. So whatever is the fruit du jour, you do that. All right, well, rather than get you all angry and inflamed, we'll stop.
Have a good trip.
I plan to. Thank you very much. And since I haven't said it to you in at least a day, have fun storming the castle.